So much happened in Congress this past week. March 10th to 14th, 2025, we saw action in both the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
Key legislation, a bunch of nominations moving forward. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're finding this overview useful. It really helps us out. But let's dive right in, shall we?
Definitely. Lots to cover. We saw progress on some really critical issues. This is kind of a window for you into how Washington works.
Starting with the Senate, what about S-331? The Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act seemed to sail through the Senate.
It's interesting, right? The speed and the consensus. It was introduced and passed all in 1 week, March 10th to the 14th. Shows a real shared commitment, I think, to tackling fentanyl trafficking. The Senate agreed to start considering it on the 10th and continued the next day on the 11th.
And they took a step to, streamline debate, right?
Yeah. On March 11th, a motion for cloture was introduced. Basically, a way to, set a time limit for debate, make sure they get to a vote. And that vote on S-331 happened on March 13th with a lot of support. 84 senators voting yay, only 15 nay.
So pretty broad support. What happened after the vote?
Well, with cloture invoked, they moved to a final vote on the 14th, passed with almost the exact same margin, 84 to 16. The final version included a substitute amendment recommended by the committee.
Right, and there was also something about a potential amendment from Senators Thune and Grassley. What was that about?
Oh, yeah. On March 13th, while the Senate was considering the bill, there was this amendment put forward by Senator Thune for Senator Grassley, Amendment number 1237. It was meant to kind of refine the bill, make some adjustments, but ultimately it was withdrawn before they got to the final vote.
So the big takeaway from the Senate is the passage of S-331 to fight fentanyl trafficking. Let's switch gears to the House. They were busy passing legislation as well.
Keeping pace, for sure. Passed two major bills. The first was H.R. 1156, the Pandemic Unemployment Fraud Enforcement Act. This one got a lot of support from both sides. Passed with 295 yeas, 127 nays.
Okay, and what's the main point of the legislation?
So remember back during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge spike in unemployment claims. Well, this bill updates the CARES Act by extending the statute of limitations for fraud, specifically for certain unemployment programs created during the pandemic. The House adopted a revised version from the Committee on Ways and Means.
Makes sense. So a move to increase accountability from those pandemic relief efforts. What was the other major bill they passed?
H.R. 1968, the Full Year Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act of 2025. This one passed, but by a much smaller margin, 217 yeas to 213 nays.
Oh, wow. That was close. What does this act do?
Well, it's all about keeping the government funded. It basically provides ongoing funding for different government operations and extends certain programs. Through the rest of the 2025 fiscal year, they use these types of acts when the regular budget process isn't finished yet, just to, keep things running smoothly.
And I think there was a bit of back and forth, even a motion to reconsider the bill, right?
Okay, you got it. Representative Meng actually proposed a motion to send the bill back to the committee for more review. It's called a motion to recommit. But in the end, the motion failed, 213 to 216. There was also an amendment laid out in House Report 119-15 that got incorporated into the bill during the process.
It looks like there was a resolution that set the stage for how they would deal with these bills.
Right. HRAs 211 laid out the rules for the debate and the voting. For HRAs 25, which is all about, digital asset sales reporting, and also HR 1156 and HR 1968, they always have to agree on these types of resolutions before they can officially consider the measures.
So kind of like setting the ground rules.
Exactly.
And the House also agreed to a couple of other resolutions, right? Like one about sending back a bill to the Senate and another one about who's on what committee.
Yeah. First, there was HRAs 212, that's the one that sent Senate Joint Resolution 3 back to the Senate. Now, we don't have specifics about that resolution here, but it's just a step they had to take regarding this measure from the Senate. And then there's HRS 214. This resolution formally assigns members to the different standing committees of the House, which is part of the normal, organizational stuff.
Makes sense. One more thing about the House. The Speaker called for a district work period. What does that mean? Are they taking a break?
It basically means that from Tuesday, March 11th to Sunday, March 23rd, the representatives were scheduled to be back in their districts working, So Instead of being in D.C. for sessions, they're back home, meeting with constituents, attending events, dealing with local issues, that sort of thing.
All right, so we've covered what happened in the Senate and what happened in the House. Let's look at the Senate's role in confirming those presidential nominations. It seems like a lot of key positions were filled this week.
You're right. The Senate confirmed a whole bunch of people to, executive branch roles. First, Stephen Bradbury, confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Transportation. The vote was 51 yeas to 46 nays. They actually had to have a cloture vote for this one. To move things along, same outcome there, 51 to 46.
They're pretty close. Who else was confirmed?
Abigail Slater. She was confirmed as an Assistant Attorney General, got a lot more support, 78 yeas to 19 nays. And the cloture vote for her confirmation also passed pretty easily. Then there's Stephen Miran. He's now the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. The vote was 53 yeas to 46 nays. And that one also had a, pretty tight cloture vote before.
Seems like invoking cloture was a bit of a trend.
Yeah.
To get past some procedural roadblocks.
It happens when there's,
Yeah.
a good amount of pushback. Keith Sonderling was also confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Labor. Same vote, 53 yeas to 46 nays. And same with cloture, similar margin. And then finally, Stephen Feinberg. He was confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Defense, 59 yeas to 40 nays. Cloture for that nomination was 56 yeas to 39 nays.
Wow. So we've seen confirmations for some major roles.
Yeah.
In transportation, the Justice Department, economic advising, labor, and defense. It also looks like the Senate got the ball rolling to confirm even more nominees with, a bunch of cloture motions filed.
Yep. They're moving forward on several other nominations. On March 11th, cloture motions were entered for William Pulte. He's been nominated to be the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and for Jeffrey Kessler to be the Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security.
And does this keep going throughout the week?
Definitely. On March 13th, cloture motion was filed for Christopher Landau to be the Deputy Secretary of State, and then on the 14th, even more, like a whole series of cloture motions for all these nominations. Michael Kratsios to be the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Jayanta Bhattacharya to lead the National Institutes of Health, Martin McCary for Commissioner of Food and Drugs, James Bishop to be Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and Aaron Reitz to serve as an Assistant Attorney General.
That's a lot of big nominations working their way through. And I see there was an agreement on the timing of some of those upcoming votes.
On March 14th, they agreed to schedule the final votes for John Phelan to be Secretary of the Navy and Christopher Landau for Deputy Secretary of State. Those are going to happen on Monday, March 24th. And the cloture votes for Kratsios, Bhattacharya, McCary, Bishop, and Reitz are all set for Tuesday, March 25th.
It looks like cloture was invoked this week for Phelan and Landau, even though their final votes aren't until next week.
That's right. On the 14th, Senate voted to invoke cloture on John Phelan's nomination, 64 yeas to 73 nays. And for Christopher Landau, it was 63 yeas to 32 nays. It's like, clearing the way for those confirmation votes next week.
So a busy week for confirmations. But it wasn't just about the floor votes, was it?
Mm-hmm.
It looks like Senate committees had a lot going on, too, both with nominations and, other issues.
Absolutely. Lots of activity in the committees. The Armed Services Committee, for example, they officially recommended the confirmations of Stephen Feinberg as Deputy Secretary of Defense and John Phelan as Secretary of the Navy, basically giving their, thumbs up before the full Senate vote.
And what other committee happenings did we see this week?
The Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Counterterrorism wrapped up a hearing on the SDOP CSAM Act. That one's all about online child safety. It's an important issue they're tackling. And then the Veterans Affairs Committee. They finished a hearing on a few different bills, all dealing with veterans issues, so clearly a focus on those who have served.
And House committees were busy, too.
Yeah, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they held hearings on a couple of big topics. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation, and also arms control, international security, and U.S. aid to Europe. So big foreign policy stuff. And then you have the House Homeland Security Committee. They had hearings on cybersecurity regulations and on preventing waste, fraud, and abuse within the Department of Homeland Security. They're the ones responsible for oversight.
And then were there hearings related to, natural resources and government operations?
Yep. The House Natural Resources Subcommittee. the one focused on federal lands. They held a hearing on H.R. 1820, the FLASH Act, and the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee. They held a hearing on preventing improper payments and fraud in government programs.
Finally, there was a markup session, right? What does that even mean? Is that like where they redline a bill?
It's actually a really important part of the process. Is when a committee sits down, they go through a bill line by line, they debate, they might make changes, amendments, before the whole House can consider it. The Ways and Means Committee had a markup on two resolutions, HRes 127 and HRes 195. These are basically requests for information from the executive branch.
Sounds pretty in-depth.
It is.
And on the Senate side, some business meetings covering a whole range of topics.
The Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, for one, they had a meeting to discuss, well, a bunch of bills and nominations, and the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee held hearings on a few different mineral-related bills. So, energy and resource management are top of mind. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee formally recommended some nominations, too, including Christopher Landau for Deputy Secretary of State, to move that process along. And finally, the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee recommended Paul Lawrence to be the Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And they also approved some resolutions about leases for major medical facilities.
Well, that was quite a week in Congress. We saw the Senate pass the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, and the House passed the Pandemic Unemployment Fraud Enforcement Act, and the Full-Year Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act. It was a lot.
It sure was. And we also saw all those nominations moving through the Senate, several confirmations for some important roles, and many more are in the pipeline, maybe even some votes coming up soon.
It's definitely been a busy week, and we got a glimpse into some of those priorities and what's happening in Washington. As a listener, I think keeping an eye on those upcoming Senate confirmation votes and maybe even diving deeper into those bills would be interesting.
This week was a great example of how things work. Between passing laws and actually filling the positions in government, it's interesting to think about how these new appointees and these new laws might change things in their areas of expertise. Fighting the fentanyl crisis, dealing with pandemic fraud, leadership in those important agencies. Lots to think about.